Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Tafur.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I was very excited and honored that you would come on because, as many people may know, I have a background in family medicine, and I also decided that the traditional practice of medicine was not necessarily what I found fulfilling, and that's what led me to start this podcast. And I know you have a similar story that led you down your path. So if you could
hmm
start by telling us a little bit about your own journey.
Sure. So, my journey is into this kind of into plant medicine is basically started getting depressed in medical school, going to medical school and finding myself depressed and never really having experienced that to that degree previously. So that was a real um, tough one for me. I mean, other people maybe had already been through things like that. And I was looking for help. My dad's a psychiatrist. I tried a little antidepressants. A lot of people were taking antidepressants, seems like, through the process, or there's reports of that. And, that I did find it a little bit helpful at the time. And but I wasn't satisfied with that, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to be doing that. And so I decided to go back to Arizona. I was studying in California, where I'm from, and go through peyote ceremony through a location that I was aware of. And so I did. It's called the Spirit Walk peyote ceremony, and yeah, I had a major experience, and it was a very very therapeutic experience, very healing for me and kind of got me back on track. And after that, I was able to continue and finish. And I went back to peyote a few times more through my training, through medical school, and then on through residency in family medicine. I was doing better, as a resident. I felt better in the sense that we just felt more engaged and effective and part of something and delivering services and being a doctor and able to kind of utilize the knowledge that we had worked so hard to get. And then when I finished residency, just 2006, I finished, and then I started doing part-time work in California for Kaiser. I was doing urgent care and primary care for them while I was trying to sort things out. And then I ended up going to do research. I was interested in academic medicine, so I went to go work at Paul Mills Lab and do a postdoctoral research fellowship. So at that time, I was getting exposed to, I was already into a lot of alternative medicine, integrative medicine. I thought about going to Chinese medical school instead of medical school. I was more interested in kind of holistic systems that were open to, basically what I call emotional and spiritual, the emotional and spiritual dimensions of not only health, but life itself. And so, I had medical training at the university I was at, UCSD, was more focused, was very, scientifically driven, clinically driven, so-called evidence-based driven. And so then, I don't know, I continued, I stayed with that, but I wanted to do research. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And around that time, I decided to go to Peru to do ayahuasca, to try ayahuasca. My family's from Colombia. I was aware of Yahe in Colombia and what is basically the equivalent of ayahuasca in Peru. And I wanted to go try it. And after my experiences with peyote, I had kind of I was starting to get exposed to the medicine man, in this case, it was male, road man, peyote road man, and the way they were operating in ceremony. And I just was very curious about that kind of, what we call shamanic work. And I wanted to go see what it was like to do ayahuasca. So I went and I had a major experience, and that's all detailed in my book, that, Fellowship of the River. And that's how I got started. And then I just started, I had a major experience, and I was really impressed as a doctor over the kind of healing that I saw happening at the center I was at. And I started to return there, and then eventually bring groups, and was part of big healings with individuals that came down in the groups, and then developed a friendship with one of the shamans working there, Ricardo Maringo, And eventually he offered whether he wanted to know if I wanted to help with the project they were trying to start with a few other people. So we started New Erao Centro Espiritual in 2011, and I worked there pretty intensely until the end of 2016, and still was affiliated and involved there for the following couple of years. And now it's running on its own. Ricardo is the sole owner. Svita Mamic was the other business partner that helped us found it and started, and we've handed it over to Ricardo, but we still bring groups there. So while I worked there, very intensively with many, many people coming through, I went through the training under Ricardo to run ceremony and work with the plants in the Shipibo tradition.
Yes.
So that's the basic, yeah.
That's the basic. The Fellowship of the River, as I understand from the book, that's essentially what you had named the training that you were devising for yourself. That's a lot of why I started the Plant Medicine podcast, because as you know, we are not trained at all on this in medical school or residency. And so
Sure.
you took it upon yourself to make this because, for those in medicine, fellowship is what comes after residency, where you subspecialize. And so you made your own fellowship. And
Yeah.
yeah, I thought that was
Well, it started as a
brilliant.
joke. It started as a joke, and that's why I turned into the name of the book because, yeah, we had finished. That's the way I introduced it. I went with my friend Kayvon, who wanted to go to. He had already done this big loop in his early 20s from all across South America, and he had this goal of like, okay, we finished all our training, we finished medical school and residency. Let's do something, fun. And he wanted to go from Iquitos, Peru, down the Amazon River to the beach in Brazil. Like he had this long-term goal of doing that. And I wanted to do ayahuasca. And so I said, well, he had done it before, so he was more comfortable. So I said, let's go. I'll go with you if you go with me. And so we put 5 weeks aside to go down the river. And so he called it the Fellowship of the River because that's what we did instead of going to fellowship. And then the joke in the book is that it actually turned into a subspecialty. It turned into a very serious intensive training in my case. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. As you mentioned that the people you were working with are of the Shipibo tradition. If you could talk a little bit about, because again, this is for people who maybe have never tried ayahuasca and they don't know where
Right.
to start. Can you talk a little bit about the fact that there are different traditions and a little bit about how they may vary?
Sure. So ayahuasca is a kind of a sacred plant medicine in the Amazonian traditions and Amazonian culture. And so the region the watershed is huge, right? It goes from the beach in Brazil all the way up the river across the entire South America, and, passing through Venezuela and Colombia and Peru into Ecuador, and even at the, extensions of the forest into other countries and regions. So across that region is very large number of tribes. So they call it the Pan-Amazonian, substance, and so it's available to these tribes all up and down. So there are I don't know how many tribes from Brazil to Peru, at least hundreds, and so there are many different traditions of people working with ayahuasca. There's been the subsequent. So ayahuasca is this tea made from usually two plants, and it can be different plants, but it's always the ayahuasca vine. And then there's a subsequent, additional plant that is often chacruna, Psychotria viridis, but is not limited to that. And different traditions use a different plant. So that is being utilized all over the place. And then there's two subsequent Brazilian, syncretic churches, the UDV and the Santo Daime, which have sprung out of kind of indigenous tradition and then syncretizing with Christianity and even some African influence in some cases to create these other churches that are functioning in Brazil that have now made their way to the United States. Their UDV and Santo Daime exist in the United States, and they're doing ayahuasca with permission from the DEA currently under the Religious Freedom Act. And so there's many different ways. And so the Shipibos are a tribe that is native to the Peruvian Upper Amazon and just Peru. And so that's kind of northwestern Peru or northeastern, eastern Peru. And so they have a very kind of ancient tradition And they're a culture that has really maintained a lot of their language, a lot of their traditions, more than some of the other cultures. And they have begun to share their practice with foreigners for some time now. So they're very well known internationally as one of the tribes that has been kind of sharing the medicine, allowing, treating people, Shipibo healers, curanderos and curanderas, healing people coming from all over the world, but also training and teaching people how to work with plants and the medicine. And so that's a Shipibo tradition. It's a Shipibo native tradition, native to the Amazon.
And between that tradition and others, like you said, there's Yahe, which is the Colombian version, and that's what I had
Mhm.
just spent last week doing. And I had done Shipibo ceremonies before, and they were very, very different.
Yeah.
Would you be able to speak a little bit about some of the major differences that people could expect if they're going to different types of ceremonies?
Yeah, well, I mean, it could be vastly different. So I think I'm not an expert in, I could only, like, you could speak to the Yahe ceremonies you've been to. And so this is the kind of thing that it's not, there is no institutionalized, you
Right.
know, standardized, like that's out, you know. Turns out that approach is not always that helpful. And a lot of people are suffering under overly standardized, overly institutionalized approaches. And so in the wide world of nature and the plants and, tribal culture, there's a lot of variation and it's very much dependent on the individuals. And so we get back into this kind of craft that is, from the master to the apprentice. So more like, I would compare it to for people like martial arts or something like that, where these different schools, right? They're doing karate, but there's different schools of karate, and it depends on your teacher and all that kind of stuff. So it's more of a fluid, organic kind of educational system. So but there are themes, in certain tribal cultures. So it really depends. Even in Colombia, Yahe, like, for people to understand, is just different. The Yahe ceremony you went to, I don't know what was did they tell you who was it, what the or tradition is or the origin of the person?
No, she had been doing it since eight. She had first been exposed to the medicine at age 7, and she was 70. So she
Hmm.
had been doing this for 60-ish years.
Right,
But she was from Putumayo, and so
right.
I only knew the region that she'd come from.
So Putumayo is lower, that's the Colombian Amazon. So that's a major tributary. So the Putumayo is a place where they've been doing it for a long time. So there's mestizos. What we call mestizo is a person that is like most of the South America or Colombian population would be considered like to have varying degrees of mestizaje. In other words, how much European blood do they have, and most of them are mixed to some degree with indigenous blood. And then there are some people who are pretty much pure indigenous. And among those pure indigenous people, there are those people whose cultures have survived, the Spanish conquest, and there are those that have not. And so there's the mestizo who is perhaps a pure blood Indian, what we would call, a Native American indigenous person, but they speak Spanish, and they might sing songs in Spanish and do their culture, maybe more what we call mestizo culture. Then there's other, within the Putumayo, there's a number of tribes, that have indigenous traditions, indigenous language, indigenous ceremony that is maintained. So there's a lot of variation right there, So that's it. Just to give people an example, like that's the huge influence is you have this colonialization process and all the varying degrees of survival of indigenous tradition. And so some people, maybe they don't have the language, but they still work with the plants from the region. Maybe they still use some of the names of the plants from the indigenous language. Other people maintain the language and keep that going. So there's all kinds of versions of that. And so then some people's traditions might be very focused in some very strong traditional way or not. So I don't know what this lady, what she did during her ceremony or how she sang. And so I think it's just the reality is it's very varied and it's very dependent on the practitioner. So
Yeah,
this kind of thing, what I can say about it is, as people are trying to learn about, it's practitioner dependent.
yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, and it's funny because you said you don't know what she sang, and this was actually the first ceremony I had undergone where there was no singing.
Hmm.
Every other ceremony
Do
had
they play
had
instruments or anything?
one of the so it was the taita with the mother and her daughter, and the
Hmm.
daughter played the harmonica at different
Yeah,
points, and that was the. I don't think there was even necessarily drumming, maybe a little bit of like leaf shaking,
yeah.
but over 4 days there was maybe a total of an hour of music, whereas the other ceremonies had been full of song. And
Hmm.
that's a thing I would like to have you elaborate on a little bit, if you could, from the Shipibo tradition. Is I remember my first ayahuasca ceremony, they were singing the whole time, but I did not know that these were called icaros, and I didn't know that the icaros were necessarily directed at people sometimes, or sometimes
Hmm.
directed at the energy of the group. If you could talk a little bit about the
Yeah.
role that music plays in that tradition.
Yeah, so there's different traditions and they work with the medicine differently and they work with the energy of people differently. And so, I don't there's a whole different approach and I know they use a lot of harmonica down there in Putumayo and you hear about that. That's an example of modern, the harmonica arrived to that area at some point, but they've taken it in and they utilize it now. And the traditional Shipibo style that I'm familiar with is the Icaro is considered like a shamanic healing song. So it's different in the sense that the Chipibos, and now we're getting deeper into like the indigenous traditions, that they are very much studying with plants, with different plants, with what they call master plants, teacher plants, and so that by dieting and doing this vegetalista diet, which is not all the tribes do that, and I don't think they do it, and some of the taitas don't do that. But in Peru, there's few groups, and into Brazil that do this vegetalista diet. Um, the Ashaninka, the Yawanawa, the Hunikuins, like they're all kind of regionally near each other. And I don't know about other places, but that's these guys do these diets. And the diets are to help connect people to the energy, the healing energy of these plants. The spirit of these plants is the concept. So it sounds very strange, but that's what it is. That's the practice, and that's the tradition. And so people learn to sing Icaros. They learn to sing a certain way uh, because of their connection to the plants. And so this style, and I don't know what kind of ceremony you went to, but like the typical Shipibo ceremony that I've been part of, that there is singing to the group and to the support everything and help things along. And then there's one-on-one singing. And the one-on-one singing is a form of energy healing. It's a spiritual healing. So it's a process that is considered very central to the Shipibo ayahuasca tradition. And that element of the ceremony is the reason why they go to the shamans, is to receive healing song.
Yeah, I read that in your book. I had not experienced the one-on-one Ikaro singing before, but you described how I'm probably going to butcher this, but it felt
Yeah,
like the songs were kind of like pulling spirits in or out of them, or helping the people who were in the
yeah,
medicine go through certain parts of their
yeah,
journey.
that's right. So there's many ways that it could play out. One way is to help somebody through their journey. Help make it easier for someone to go through something. Perhaps that's one simple way. And then there's just like varying degrees of and that's the book tries to describe, people's experiences during those songs. It's not always, sometimes they have very big experiences outside of being sung to. Sometimes while being sung to, they don't feel that much, but the shaman is experiencing something during the song. That's the purpose of what they're doing. And then sometimes the people really feel that. And so they may feel all kinds of things, big releases, big movement. They may have visions around, what's going on and what's being done. And so it's a whole art form, it's very, very central to what we do. And, it's just like there's so many versions of that. I don't know where to begin, it's just, but it's about healing. It's about helping people let go, helping people forgive, helping people find more compassion, find more gratitude, and ultimately self-love. And that process, like at an energetic or kind of metaphysical description, might be about trying to figure out where they're blocked, and helping them move through that, release that, transform that, reconcile that. So the songs are about that.
It was fascinating to me how you were describing when you were in your training and you were learning the process of how to do Icaros for others, of what you were being instructed to feel into. And so if somebody is sitting in ceremony and the person facilitating, the shaman or maybe even one of the assistants, comes up and is singing an Icaro for them, can you describe a little bit about how the person who is doing the singing may feel the calling, or how they get inspired to
Right.
help in those ways?
Yeah, well, it's like first, it's maybe it's simple in the sense that as a doctor or as a psychotherapist or any kind of counselor or whatever it is, or just as a friend, you're just trying to engage with the person. And when you engage with someone, and you kind of try to do it at a deeper level, like the first step of that, and I kind of talk about this concept in the book that is in psychotherapy, people have talked about from a biological perspective, is like a limbic resonance, that you tune into the person. And that human beings, as they kind of engage with each other with eye contact or close proximity, or tone of voice, or all these different, ways that we express ourselves, that you start tuning in to that person. So with a friend across the room, you can just look each other in the eyes and you have an idea about what's going on in their internal world. So that's just a normal human thing. It's part of everyday life. And so that's how it begins. So you're simply trying to open a connection between yourself and this person that's going to allow you kind of, and then obviously with the ayahuasca on board, that's going to amplify a lot of that opening between people. And so then you are spending time trying to tune in to that person, and you have your training, which is geared towards trying to develop your intuition, which is basically some kind of like metacognition of what you're picking up from that person. And then with the ayahuasca, that and the training, you're also trying to see if that helps you in kind of a visionary way, and what people would consider like a third eye type of perspective or some kind of dream lens. But and through a visionary sense, you're trying to see what you can see in the person's body and their energy and their heart and their mind, and their spirit. And so then you've talked to them beforehand, realistically. So there's a lot of different versions of this, and people will downplay the role of dialogue and conversation in Native American practice, but it's really just a language barrier. I repeat that all the time. That's an ignorance. So if this lady didn't talk to you and all that stuff, well, that's unfortunate. But if you were from her village, she would talk to you actually a lot, probably. And that would really inform what she's doing, like anything else. And so at our Ricardo is and all this any Shipibo patient that comes in, they're going to have a lot of conversation. And so we, through translation, it's considered to be a very important part, is getting to understand what the person, why they're coming, what they want to work on. And then in the moment, like what's happening to them, what's their personal experience like in that moment. So now with that knowledge, you're going to move forward with the song that is, for us, it's like the way you're singing, the melody, things like that. That's very much inspired from your diets and your training and the kind of the channeling of that energy. But then it's guided by the words and the articulation of what actually you are doing. So the Shipibo Ikaro is an improvisation, which you're actually singing what you are doing while you're doing it, what you see, and how you're cleaning it, and how you're trying to help the person. So it's very present practice, and that's part of the key to the engagement, to the energy, is the presence of it.
Wow, that's beautiful. And you brought up something in there that if somebody's totally new to ayahuasca, it may be surprising to them. But you said with there's ayahuasca on board, the person facilitating is also taking the medicine.
That's generally the case. That's generally the case in the Shipibo tradition. That is the case in their tradition. The ayahuasquero is called ayahuasquero because they drink ayahuasca. The patient does not necessarily drink in their tradition. And so the idea is that the patient who's already open to this kind of energetic treatment is coming to receive Ikaro, healing song, for as a form of energy healing and diagnosis. They're going to allow this person to help try to see what they can see with their visionary training, and then with their energetic work to try to help the person get over this or that, or work through something, or help them even physically. So it's more important that the shaman drinks than the patient. And
Interesting.
so, yeah, that's
Wow.
different. There's other ways. And that's because of this whole Ikaro and the shamanism side, where some of the other traditions, like, let's say with Yahe, where it's like considered like, la purga, like people get together to as a purgative, to purge. And that is, they obviously use it that way as well, that the patient, even with no training with ayahuasca, stands to benefit, but it's going to be much different, what they can do with the medicine versus someone who's highly trained.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to get back to you were talking about the vegetalista diet. And one of the things in the book that struck me the most is as a physician, I was stunned to see the range of ailments that you and your center were addressing through both ayahuasca and ceremony, but also with the dietas.
Yeah, and the plant medicines, yeah. Yeah, well, that's what I there's plant medicines who probably have more of a pharmacologic, benefit. And so there were factors that described in the book, because the traditional Amazonian plant medicine all over the Amazon, including these people you were working with from Putumayo, that ayahuasca or yahe is just one element of the pharmacopoeia that they are working with in the Amazon. So just like, you have traditional Chinese medicine, and so there's a lot of interest in acupuncture. But then there's some people like MDs want to learn acupuncture, but then they don't want to learn about the herbal medicine of the Chinese system. Whereas when you talk to Chinese medicine practitioners, well, the herbal medicine is a humongous, part of their tradition and their practice and their knowledge and their effectiveness. That being said, so Amazonian plant medicine, traditional Amazonian plant medicine, is existing in the Amazon rainforest. So there are thousands of plants to draw from that different cultures are going to use for many different ailments. So, in the book, for example, we talk about some uterine problems, that some people were having, and they were using certain plants to try to that are known to help with reproductive issues, or in this case, it was like uterine issues and ovarian issues, and so some plants were being used that way. Other plants are being applied topically, sometimes also for their just very direct effect. So including in the psoriasis case, they were using, which was just something I hadn't heard of as a doctor, but then I later with sulfur, using sulfur, just mixing it in jungle style into Vicks Vapor Rub, so that you could use it as a delivery lotion, and rubbing sulfur onto people's psoriasis. And then later I was doing research, and yeah, in the Middle East, it's a very ancient tradition to go into sulfur hot springs to deal with psoriasis. So there is something there. So that was just some shaman from the jungle. I don't know where he came up with that, but we were doing that kind of stuff. So there was that. There's that. There's stuff for intestinal. There's plants that are known to have an intestinal impact and kind of calm things down. And that's like the ohe plant that we're using, the tree. So that's all there. And there's no question that there's benefit there at some kind of plant pharmacologic level. But the theme of the book, what I try to talk about, is how what really seemed to be such a big thing tying together these very different, so-called different ailments, from a Western system, where we're working off the organ-based system. And, this is, like I say, then you have migraine headaches, you're going to go see the neurologist. You have PTSD, they're going to send you to a psychiatrist. If you have ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, they're going to send you to gastroenterology, and so on. This chronic pain case that's presented, she's seeing somebody for possible back surgery and possible knee surgery in her early 30s. So how did all these people make progress in what would medically be considered different, departments and fields? And each case, it was an emotional healing process that linked these different ailments. And so we're learning so much about that right now. There's so much knowledge growing in the role of emotional trauma and its effect on, what is described in the book and in medicine, and, Dr. Paul Mills and his lab and the time I spent there, what we call psychoneuroimmunology or psychoneuroendocrine immunology, which is basically the study of mind-body, connection, psychosomatic illness, the way that how we think and feel affects the way our body works, which we know as a common sense concept is extremely important. But it's very hard to get at that stuff in a 15-minute visit. We're not going to get to it. And, as a doctor, there's a ton of material that we're learning and trying to cover. So when do you learn the rest of the stuff? When do you learn what you're supposed to learn, and how much of a hard time are we going to give the doctors for not knowing about this or not knowing about that, after we're tortured and then asked to, deal with life-threatening illness on the front lines and watch people die and suffer. So there is got to be a little more room to take care of the doctors while we try to invite this healing, work into it. That being said, there is this issue of like the arrogance of the system, of a frustrated community that, feels underserved, namely the doctors, frustrated about their path and angry and not really wanting to hear it, from this or that, or what good is that, or where's the, there's all this, I don't know, it's just very similar to some of the national discussion, just this frustration and this anger driving just a closed-mindedness. And so there's that's going on. And then the problem is then and this is my thing, is like, well, we're trying to be so-called conservative, like that side is so-called conservative, but they're just wasting, healthcare resources by not getting to the root of the matter. And the reason why that's so significant is because in the book, we're talking about people who go 2 or 3 weeks, 10 days, and are having a major revolution in their personal health that is decreasing their healthcare expenditures dramatically.
Yes.
So from a conservative perspective, like it's very unwise not to look at, what is this thing where you realize how sexual abuse, was underlying this person's ulcerative colitis. And when you do research into ulcerative colitis and some of the inflammatory bowel disease, there is evidence of all this comorbidity and the psychosomatic element of it. It's been talked about like from the 70s. You can find papers on psychosomatics of this, and these are just common sense human concepts. The idea that some asthma is related to anxiety. That we just know very well all about that. And that's what I try to present in the book a lot, is this concept of an emotional body, that there is an emotional body that's been described by other traditions and philosophies, Chinese medicine, Ayurveda. But again, I think what I see happening in our society, in American society, in a lot of places, there is such a limited space for professionals, whether that's corporate. You've been to the law world, you've been to the medical world, and then we got the corporate world and the business world, and all the materialist leaders that are whatever, taking us wherever we're going. And there's no real space for them to be vulnerable. And that's the real problem. And so that's it right there. So they don't want to be vulnerable. They don't feel safe to be vulnerable. There's no space for them to be vulnerable. And so going into vulnerable topics is not exciting, to the person whose wounds are untended.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's it right there. And so they don't want to talk about, you know, their personal family life at an academic medical conference,
True.
which is, from a common sense perspective, is a profoundly ignorant um, approach to the reality of health.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you had a child, just watch it. If you had a dog and the dog was raised in these very poor conditions and treated, traumatized psychologically, emotionally, being mistreated, and it would not be surprising that that dog would develop health problems. You know, no, not at all. Like basically only a fool wouldn't recognize that. And so somehow we've created this very large mystery around that when it comes to the complexity of the human, situation. And a lot of it is because, there is no safe place for people to be vulnerable. And then when we see that, like that's, with the case of combat veteran PTSD, and, there's a movie From Shock to Awe. I don't know if you've talked to those people, but they're wonderful.
Yes.
People who made that movie, Janine Saggart and I can't remember his last name. But, one of the guys, so these are all American guys, these are really trying to do the right thing. American soldiers, heavy combat experience, being sent over there for who knows why, right? At the mercy of the political powers and the money behind them. And so these are the actual guys with the guts that are going to, if this is what you say we're supposed to do, I guess we're going to do it because I know you won't do it. The cowards won't get near that.
Right.
So these are the ones that are like, these are the people that are inspired. Their bravery inspires a lot of people. And it is impressive how brave these guys are. And then they go through their trauma, their PTSD. In the movie, they show all these guys going to the VA for 2 years. Over 2 years, the guy had 80 prescriptions, in his cabinet, and he says they're all worthless. They make him feel terrible. It's not helping him at all. And then they get into marijuana, and marijuana like alleviates their symptoms to some degree, and so they're happy. It's easier. There's less side effects. There's less problems than the other stuff. And then eventually, these guys go into ayahuasca, and they have these major breakthroughs around their healing process and forgiving themselves for some of the terrible things that have happened to them, and for some of the terrible things that they did, that they were asked to do, and that they did. And one of them has this huge wake up. And he's like, oh my God. It's like our society has become just a repository of trauma. And so that's what we see. That's what it looks like. When you have unhealed, untended trauma, trauma upon trauma upon trauma, with no room for vulnerability, no room for grieving, no room for the caring, the humanity. And so now you're visiting Colombia, Colombia is a place of a lot of violence, a lot of trouble. And there's definitely trauma issues there for sure. But, you see the warmth in the society and the culture is dramatically different, for me, when you land at the airport. And the idea is that the people there, there is a recognition of the need and the space for people to be vulnerable. Their hearts and souls have a place at the cultural discussion. It's not something you can really deny, that how you feel matters.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying to make room for again in the US, because we've gone this other route, which has been this more materialistic kind of focus. When it's led to a lot of gains, in Western medicine. We have the antibiotics, we have the surgical techniques, we have all these breakthroughs that make a big difference for many, many people in many, many ways. But as we get overly focused in just that aspect, just the material dimension, and then we start kind of denying or neglecting like the subjective experience of being alive, which meanwhile is like not going away in the world of music. They're singing about it all day, every day. People are exposed to this. And then in sports, where I think they really let people really let their passions just fly. But then somehow when it comes to healthcare, that stuff is left at the door. This very human side of life. And so that's what we're trying to demonstrate. And I think that's the big deal. That's why I think a lot of Americans and people from Europe and Canada are going to the Amazon. Like I said, what I observed as a doctor working down there, it's like, why did they come down here? What did they get out of being here? Obviously, there's a psychedelic, therapeutic experience, and we're learning a lot about that. And that's major. But I think what the psychedelic therapeutic experience opens up for a lot of people is an opportunity to work through like the emotional and spiritual dimensions of their health.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's but you need, we have a long ways to go up here because there's so much to address along those lines. People need time. They need more time.
Yes.
If you don't have any time, you're never going to develop a local cuisine like in Medellin or maybe in, Louisiana or wherever they have it, or music style or fashion style, all those things, I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. Like, I don't know, people are too busy. It's a newer place. We don't have the same history as other places. There is a Native American tradition here from before that is present, but it's recovering from, major assault. But it's like people are just, they go to work and then that's, what else is there? There's not enough time for people to really be with their families, to raise their children, all those kind of things. That is just, does it make a difference if you're present with your child? Yeah. That's just like, come on, guys. Yeah. Should we ask people to, leave their children and go work in some whatever and think that that's going to be like beneficial for the society?
Yeah.
So these are just basic human things. But unless you have a place, a venue to say these things and speak about these things and grieve and cry and suffer and not worry about being judged or somehow having some opportunity closed to you, or somehow that you're exposing something that's going to make them vulnerable in a way that they don't want to be, so then you're going to be shunned to keep that element out. The problem is it's just the more we do all that, the more the healthcare crisis grows.
Yeah.
Because these are just basic biological issues. So that's a big part of what I talk about a lot is this emotional body is a real thing. Emotional biology is a real thing. We've studied it in all many different angles for a long, long time, from whether it's animal emotional biology to human emotional biology. So we know that emotional trauma, we know that neglect of young primates, neglect of young children, neglect of young rodents has major impact on long-term health in the mammal and the human being. And we know that major traumatic experience, whether that's sexual abuse or combat, have profound impacts on people's not only mental health, but their physical health. That's just an established fact. And the way that feeds into a lot of inflammatory problems and stress-related inflammation, the way that would lead to increased flares of autoimmune illness. We know people when they have psoriasis, when they go through an emotional crisis, they flare. It's not a surprise. That's just a basic common sense fact. We know that a lot of people's inflammatory bowel disease gets worse when they're going through emotional crisis. So addressing their emotional resiliency, which apparently has some kind of biological reality to it. I mean, they're having bloody stools with diarrhea. So I don't know. That's just, well, I guess it's coming out of thin air, but there it is. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know what it takes for people to, I hate to say it, but I guess it takes bloody stool for people to actually like notice, like, what is this? What is the toll
Right.
of this? And as we are able to help people improve their resiliency, help them work through um, that trauma and heal and transform it as much as possible and overcome the way that it triggers them, like a PTSD type of healing. And sometimes it's just simple neglect. It's very mild things, that or things that maybe they're not as traumatic as sexual abuse or combat, but they bother us and we suffer over them, in our minds. And we don't have a place to let that go, And I was in medical school and I had a very fortunate life in general, but I got into some mental processes and I got all screwed up and I couldn't really get out of it. And it wasn't until I did peyote, that I was able to just stop that and re-engage in what's available to us, when we can quiet our minds and reconnect to our hearts. And that's where we start to be able to work through things that ultimately are going to improve our immune function.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate very much that you brought up not only that in our current healthcare system, the physicians are getting 15 minutes with the patient, so we never get into the patient's emotional biology, and also the physicians themselves don't have any time in the day to get into their own, nor generally a space to be vulnerable enough to get into their own. So nobody involved in the system, neither the doctor nor the patient, is able to do the work generally necessary to get through these these blockages, or like you said, the trauma doesn't have to be combat. In my first day of Yahe last week, when I did finally purge, I was just crying out years of medicine, years of being in the medical system and having to take in things, or telling patients' families that they're going to die, or delivering
Right.
bad news, or just having to just absorb other people's emotions for so long. Because when you're in that doctor's office, you don't get to show your emotions. You have to be the person in charge, and if they're showing emotion, you have to stay neutral best you can. Especially, I worked at the VA for 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
Our training said don't be friends with the person. You are there to evaluate them and nothing more. And so after 14 years of that, I was just purging out the weight of that. And so it's not on the field combat, but it takes its toll. And so, like you mentioned with the from shock to awe people, I have Jesse from Heroic Hearts on for the ayahuasca patient episode,
Right.
and that inspired me after my first day of Yahe. Is like, there needs to be an equivalent that brings doctors down to
Yeah.
experience this kind of healing, because it's
Well, we've
only
been doing
there.
that. We've
Yeah.
been taking groups. So I take groups of doctors and I take groups of psychotherapists I've taken them to Niue Rao. We've had several groups. We have groups of naturopathic, groups of medical doctors, groups of psychotherapists, and to Solterra. And yeah, it's really special. And it's like what you're saying. And this is back to traditional systems. And you can't. The institutional healthcare is not going to necessarily be the place for this to happen. But hopefully they just open up more time and resources for people to do what they need to do. There's somebody, a trauma researcher, was exploring MDMA psychotherapy, and there's all that research, and my research project is related to the MDMA psychotherapy project. So the MDMA assisted psychotherapy that MAPS is running for treatment-resistant PTSD, which is extremely impactful, revolutionary. The people have an average of, I think, 18 years of treatment-resistant PTSD just to enter the study. So that means nothing's worked, and they've been ill for 20 years. And then they have a 12-week intervention that involves, I think, 3 episodes or maybe even 2 episodes of MDMA sessions, and then the 12 weeks of therapy. And at 1 year follow-up, over 67% or almost 70% no longer have PTSD by, criteria. So this is a major shift that's going on for these people. And one of the trauma researchers that was like getting exposed to this is like, wow, seeing the sessions, that one of the major things that she observed was that this is like 6 to 8 hours, so much more happens. Like 15 minutes is one thing. An hour, you're really not going to get that far. 2 hours, you're going to get somewhere, but like 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, things really open up. And then you have the retreat, approach, the healing retreat, like what we did with people on the dieta, people going for 10 days. And so it's just all day, every day, they're in a process. So that's very traditional. That is all the tribes all over the place that, you need extensive time periods to really address things. And that's part of, I think, what there is getting such the impressive results. Obviously, this MDMA is a part of it, but it's also the 6 to 8 hour session with these therapists who are just there with you through it all. And that's what allows things to happen. And that it just kind of makes sense, right? I mean, what can you really achieve? It's just totally different what you can achieve in retreat, and the importance of healing retreats and the traditional significance of healing retreats. That to really address some of this stuff, you kind of have to take a break from everything. And again, that doesn't really fit into the system, but it's just like back to the thing, the amount of money that's being, obviously it's very expensive to do this MDMA psychotherapy with the 2 sitters and the thing and the therapist, but how much money are they saving compared to 20 years of PTSD treatment at the VA, for example?
Yeah.
How much money was just saved by the guys who went to, Soul Quest and From Shock to Awe. So it's more effective, and that's what we're trying to learn is what is effective. And it takes time. It takes more time to work through stuff. You need to set time aside. Otherwise, you're going to be spinning your wheels for decades and decades, as it turns out.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. Like you said, there's one thing, the treatment is expensive, but then if you're saving 2 decades of PTSD treatment, but also the contribution you can make to society when you're highly functioning, when you're healed,
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
it's an entirely
Yeah.
different
That's
scenario.
no. It's very exactly. That's just it. So it's trying to, but it's hard because of per usual what's going on there with the 15-minute visits. And so you said the doctors are burning out. They're not happy. And the patients, I mean, some issues are getting addressed, but a lot aren't. And so what's going on? Well, yeah, what's going on is some people are making a lot of money on that situation. I mean, how else do you explain the motivation for that? Why do I that's killed myself through medical training and all that, and then I'm going to go work for somebody that has never stayed up all night in the intensive care unit with a dying person, and be told I need to see this many people or that many people, I guess because that person wants to buy a boat, ultimately is the fact.
Yeah.
That is the motivation.
Yeah.
So that's, I'm not saying that's fine. That's can go on, but it's unfortunate, that people that were all kind of going along with that in that type of situation, especially around healthcare, especially that even that individual themselves, who may need healthcare or a family member may need healthcare, that just would be a major consideration to figure out how to help the doctors lead a more satisfying life.
Yes, exactly. And I so appreciate that you have been part of taking healers down to get like you said, the Soltara or your center to get that kind of treatment, even just to get the new perspective. Because I think for a lot of people that are so in the matrix, you went to medical school, this is what you do after medical school, this is what everybody else that you graduated from school and residency is doing, that it's sometimes hard to see that there's another way. And I think that's a lot of what ayahuasca can do for people is open their minds to other perspectives and show what's actually important in life, and maybe reveal some of those traumas that being in that society kind of keeps shoved down, because like you said, there's that monetary goal and there's the kind of collective trauma from I've spent so much of my life in this very difficult path that I'm going to keep charging forward and just keep these things down that will
Mhm.
eventually manifest in some kind of could eventually manifest in some kind of physical or
Yeah, at the very
yeah,
least, burnout, you
exactly.
know, like that
Exactly.
doesn't, I think people will agree on that one. They don't have to get too tricky, and the
Yeah.
evidence is there.
Yeah.
The evidence is there that, as I quoted in the book, it was like a 2016, from 2013 to 2016, I don't know if it was family medicine or what it was, but MD burnout was up from 40% to 46%.
Yeah.
So
It's
now,
insane.
like this thing that they're selling you on, oh, you get to be a doctor. Oh, you're the lucky one, you know? And it's like, well, what is that?
Right.
What kind of path is that?
Yeah.
It's just, so, and there's 50% that are happy and doing well. And so it's just trying to figure out what's going on there for the other ones. But there's room for improvement ultimately is what we're talking about. And some of the improvement is really simple. I mean, as far as ayahuasca and plant medicine, it's very practitioner dependent. People have to be very careful. There are risks involved. It's not for everybody. And so that's one of the points of the book for me is that, what is it that they're, forget ayahuasca, like what is it that people are getting from this approach that they're not getting? So it's like, well, it turns out you're going to need to figure out a way to deal with some of this deep emotional wounding. That's going to be important for your health. This is one way to do that, in the right hands with the right, respect and care and responsibility. This could be a very profound way to do that, and not just open your mind, but in the right care, like to really make a difference, to really make a shift. That's different. And there's very different degrees of experiences. There's weekend ceremonial experiences, throughout the states, which is very different from doing a 10-day, 2 week, or longer dieta in the Amazon. Yeah, actually, it's a humongous difference. And you can see the difference because if you work at a place like that, you know where people are getting in 2 days into their experience versus where they're getting in 10 days into their experience. And it's not equivalent. So a lot of people have never even been exposed to that, and maybe they won't get the chance, to go down there and do that. And there's legal issues, but we're seeing similar results from new pathways and avenues from psychedelics to psychotherapy, from psilocybin-related work and MDMA work. And so that's what we're trying to our research projects to touch on that here at the end here. The Modern Spirit Epigenetics Project, which is a crowd-funded project. We're trying to raise money, modernspirit.org. We're trying to ask people, doctors, everybody, to just give a little bit of money to the crowd fund, $5, $10, $20, or whatever you can give to help us realize this thing that I think is going to be very impactful. Because we're talking about how do we bridge these worlds? How do we show the relevance to the biomedical model of this deep emotional healing? That's the question. And so when we see this MDMA assisted psychotherapy trial, where I'm talking about this really dramatic shift in PTSD, that we can say, definitively that, yeah, there's major mental health improvements going on, and that there are likely, and in many cases, physical improvements going on that would be linked physiologically to their mental health and are rooted in this emotional trauma that is part of their PTSD history. So we know all those pieces. PTSD is the really obvious example of how deep emotional trauma has major mental and physical effects. And then we see these people have this revolution in a 12-week intervention. 1 year later, almost 70% of them don't qualify for PTSD anymore. So something shifted in a stable, at least 1 year out, and they have data on people a couple of years, 2, 3, 4 years, some of the individuals. So something shifted in a stable way. And that stability would reflect some kind of biochemical physiologic shift. I think given the improvement and the brain functioning, et cetera, et cetera. So what is that? How do you measure that? What is that? And so then there's this growing body of evidence as we try to see how trauma affects people physiologically, that the epigenetics is a place where people can be marked or imprinted. And stable changes can be made from, for example, maltreatment of young primates, uh, associated correlated findings and adverse childhood experiences linked to epigenetic um, imprints affecting the way people's stress response systems work. That people's stress response systems have major emotional connections. Like that's not a big surprise. The cortisol receptor, things like that. The HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary axis, very well studied in PTSD that these people have a disrupted stress response system. They're hypervigilant, they're overreacting to emotional stresses, to other forms of stress. So their body is physically affected. And we know it's from the trauma. And there's epigenetic imprinting, little biochemical taggings around the DNA that are linked to that kind of trauma. And it seemed to kind of, to some degree, hold the memory of that trauma. And that cellular memory is epigenetically kind of programmed. And that's one of the places that we record, phenomena and the way the body records phenomena in an attempt to adapt to stress and be prepared for future events. But if it accumulates, this so-called emotional baggage starts accumulating to the point where it's no longer helpful. And we see the dog that we're stressing a little bit, and maybe a little bit of stress makes him stronger, But we keep stressing him until we break it, until we break the spirit of that animal. And then the hair starts falling out and they start sniveling around. And so now we know that there's likely some epigenetic biological impact there. Then we see this, how do we shift that? If this is a software and it's not a hardware, like I say, if it's not the DNA code, but it's some programming that's going on around the code in response to, for example, emotional stress, how do we shift that? Can that shift? We see these people are shifting. We see these people had PTSD and now they don't. Before they told them, oh, that's chronic disease. You were in Vietnam, sorry. How old are you now? Oh, you still got PTSD? Yeah, well, this is the VA, welcome to the club. And then all of a sudden they say, whoa, maybe not everybody, but some of these people, a lot of them, maybe a majority of them could really improve and maybe, in fact, heal, like not really be debilitated by the illness, be able to function again at a higher level. So there's different people that have healed that way from just psychotherapy or from family love or from all kinds of ways that people have overcome that. And so there will be probably some shift around that. And so there is evidence that epigenetics shift in response to, there's limited evidence, but there's some evidence into psychotherapy, to antidepressants, and now we know to meditation. So different states of consciousness are affecting the way this epigenetics is functioning, which is just a new frontier. If somebody's making that improvement with PTSD that way, the way they're doing in the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial, is that an epigenetic phenomenon? And if it is, can we prove that? Can we demonstrate that? And if we can demonstrate that, well, now we've shown how profound emotional healing in a therapeutic sense can really affect somebody's biochemistry. And we can start linking the biomedical model to this emotional world, which eventually leads us into a more mystical, spiritual realm. And so that's what we're trying to do. And so we have currently raised enough money to collect. We're collecting samples actively in the mouse trial, and we're going to get up to like 40 or 50, I think is what we're going to have access to, which would be enough to get some statistics, saliva samples. And then we have most of the money, but we're trying to raise more money because it's expensive to do the laboratory analysis. So that's what we have the crowdfund. If we're able to complete all that, later this year, we'll have the samples, and it'll probably just take about a month or so to run the labs, and we'll have some knowledge.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm so excited that you all are doing that and taking a look because as we know, part of what's going to help bring this, like you said, bridge that gap and merge these worlds is scientific evidence like this to
That's right.
quantify what we know is true, but some people need to see the data And
Yeah,
so thank you for being part of bringing that data. And you said it's modernspirit.org, correct?
that's right. Yes.
And if you can't remember that, it's on the front page of plantmedicine.org. Just scroll down. It's like there's a button right in
Thank
the
you.
middle.
Thanks for
Absolutely.
your help.
Yes, no, I mean it's just so close to my heart. And we're also going to put links in the show notes to your book and to also the places that you have that people can visit to hopefully if they are healers in need of healing or not even healers,
Yeah.
but are interested in pursuing these
Yeah.
these routes.
I'm doing a live event here, and it's going to be a webinar too. I don't know. We're not getting too many takers on the webinar. I think my friend says people are webinared out. I don't know how it is, but it's $20. They told me charge $20 for the webinar, but no one's signing up. So either lower the price, I don't know, or just let it go. But it's February 15th, and I'm going to be talking about um, spending more time talking about the concepts around the book and just insights into emotional healing, but also psychedelic therapies from the ayahuasca perspective. I've been through the degree of the MAPS training. I'm going through that process, and I'm familiar with the assisted psychotherapy, and then really looking into that and how that, but from a unabashed like emotional and spiritual perspective. That's called, just for the fun of it. It's called spiritual healing love science. The point of it is, and no one's really going for it, but the point is, and I just need a marketing expert. I'm not good at, I'm a fool of marketing. But the idea is that as I go to conferences and speak, we have this issue around, when we talk bridge science and spirituality, which I'm saying emotional biology is the bridge. That's my message. But when we're trying to bridge it, a lot of times we start at the science side, we start at the materialist side, and then we end up stumbling around basic common sense concepts. Like I say, love. That love doesn't have a professional or academic role or place. To talk about that would be considered unprofessional or unintellectual, and yet that is a very extremely foolish and borderline idiotic perspective. You to think that, let's say with a child, that not loving the child versus loving the child, as we've been using the example of the dog, that it's just, if you really want the person to be healthy, and you see that in Colombia, people in general, and obviously there's a more homogenous culture, there's a lot of factors, you're over there, but the way people treat children, together, anywhere,
Yeah.
is different because they recognize that that's extremely important.
Yeah.
What love you put into that child is going to have major consequences for the society.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying they have a lot of problems, but there's just a little bit more of that flavor. You feel it a little bit more, and you don't have to hide that or explain that or have a study to prove that. Right. And so, anyways, that's why it's called spiritual healing love science. So instead of starting from the science part, we're going to start from the spiritual side and work towards the science side. And my point is, if we start that way, spiritual healing love science, there's no problem. There's no,
Yeah.
there's no choque, no problem, no clash.
Okay. I love
But
it.
the other side, there's a problem. So why don't we start here? And that's from my Navajo friend, my Dene friend, Belinda, that we go around these conferences. And she says, how come spirit is always trying to catch up to science? She's like, that's the whole problem. That's why everybody's sick.
Yeah. Yeah. This is true.
So why don't you go spirit first? So I get it. I get why people don't want to get on that topic, and it's tricky and religious trauma. But we're just talking about some universality. The idea that there is a mystery that we have to deal with.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, your webinar will be before this episode comes out. However, hopefully you will record it, and then maybe we can put a link to it in the show notes, and then people can
That'd be awesome.
check it out for themselves. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for you coming on and sharing everything you've shared today. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for your path too.
Absolutely.
Thanks for enjoying good old Medellin.
Good old Medellin. Yes.
I love to Medellin. Have a buñuelo for me.
I will. And many, many arepas.
Yeah, good idea.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And for everybody else out there, until next time.